Welcome back to CSS Breakdown, book by book, season '06, episode '02, where we dive deep into Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern British History, 4th edition. Have you ever wondered how a nation, fresh from a monumental war, navigated an era of profound social upheaval, economic distress, and political reform, all under the helm of a party determined to preserve the status quo? Today, we're taking on a particularly fascinating deep dive into Britain under the Tories between 1815 and 1830. We'll be unpacking the layers of political, social, and economic challenges faced by a nation reeling from the Napoleonic Wars, and see how a seemingly rigid government navigated a period on the brink of revolution.
It's a really compelling period, and what's great about using Lowe's work is how it helps us understand not just what happened, but why it mattered. It really connects the dots between the big events, the shifts in power, and crucially, the everyday lives of ordinary people. We'll be exploring this complex web of problems and, well, the often contradictory responses of the governing party.
Okay, so let's paint the picture. Britain, 1815, victory over Napoleon, yes, but internally, sounds like a real powder keg.
Absolutely. At the very top, you've got King George III. He's 77, but he's been mentally unwell since 1811.
So his son, George, the Prince Regent, is running things.
That's right, the Regency period from 1811 to 1820. Then the Prince Regent becomes King George IV, reigning until 1830. And let's just say he wasn't exactly popular.
Sources mention extravagance, immorality, laziness.
All of the above. Known for being quite selfish, too. Not a figure who inspired much confidence during such a difficult time.
And politically, the Tories were in charge.
Yes, and they'd been in power for a remarkably long time, since 1783. The prime minister in 1815 was Lord Liverpool, who'd taken over in 1812.
Lowe describes him as mild-mannered, modest, not exactly dynamic.
Maybe not flashy, but his real strength, apparently, was his exceptional ability to manage his cabinet, to reconcile all these, well, squabbling ministers.
Rear Castlereagh, the foreign secretary.
Exactly. A key figure, very capable. Though his tragic suicide in 1822 really shakes things up later on.
And the opposition were the Whigs, though the labels are different back then.
Right. No conservative or liberal parties in the modern sense. Yeah, just Whigs and Tories, mostly.
And Liverpool's government inherited, well, a massive mess. Lowe calls it probably the most complex set of problems ever faced by a British government up to that date.
That sounds about right. You've got huge economic distress, social problems boiling over, the demand for Catholic emancipation in Ireland heating up.
And real fear of revolution, like France in 1789.
Definitely. There were disturbances that genuinely made the government think Britain was on the brink.
So their first move was?
Primarily, clamp down. Strong measures to maintain law and order. But crucially, very little was done initially to actually relieve the distress people were feeling.
But that changed. You mentioned liberal Toryism.
It did, around 1822. Liverpool strategically brought in some new faces, people with more, let's say, progressive ideas. Figures like George Canning, Robert Peel, William Huskisson.
And this led to reforms.
Yes, some much-needed reforms started to happen. But it wasn't an overnight switch. It's more nuanced than that.
That's interesting. And the parties themselves, you said they weren't like modern parties?
Not at all. Think loose factions, not rigid organizations. MPs often voted independently. Party discipline wasn't really a thing yet.
And Tory was actually an insult originally.
Yeah, both Whig and Tory started as terms of abuse way back in Charles II's time. Whig, from Whigamore, Scottish dissenters, and Tory meaning robber in Irish. By 1815, people mostly forgot the origins, but the name stuck.
So the Whigs, who were they, exactly?
Mostly aristocratic landowners. Broadly speaking, they wanted less crown influence, had some sympathy for Catholics and nonconformists, and looked after merchant and banker interests. They kind of liked the idea of reforming the voting system, but couldn't agree on how.
Key figures being Lord Grey, Henry Brougham.
Yes, Grey was a leading aristocrat, Brougham a brilliant lawyer from a slightly more modest background.
And the Tories, their main goal was?
Preservation. Keep things as they are. Maintain the power of the monarch, protect the Anglican Church. They were generally less tolerant of nonconformists.
And definitely keen on law and order, especially after the French Revolution.
Absolutely terrified by it. So yes, strict law and order, and generally opposed to any significant parliamentary reform.
But even they weren't united. You mentioned divisions.
Big divisions. You had the high Tories, very rigid, like Lord Sidmouth or the Duke of Wellington later on. And then the reforming, or liberal Tories, Canning, Peel, Huskisson, who were more open to well, some changes.
It really highlights Liverpool's skill in keeping them together. That duel you mentioned between Castlereagh and Canning in 1809.
Right, over the conduct of the war. Canning got wounded in the thigh, had to leave the cabinet for a bit. Shows the kind of tensions Liverpool had to manage after 1812.
And then there were the radicals, inspired by the French Revolution.
Very much so. Liberty, equality, fraternity really resonated. They didn't have many MPs, maybe Sir Francis Burdett, Joseph Hume.
But their influence was more outside Parliament.
Definitely. Leaders like Major Cartwright, the famous orator Hunt, William Cobbett with his journalism, even Francis Place, a tailor whose shop became a radical hub.
And radical meaning getting to the root of the problem.
Exactly, from the Latin radix. They wanted fundamental reform of the political system and, crucially, to improve conditions for the working class. Though they disagreed on methods.
Mostly peaceful methods, though.
Generally, yes. Most weren't pushing for violence. Their philosophy was heavily influenced by Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism.
The greatest happiness of the greatest number.
That's the one. Which for them meant two main things. First, government needed to be efficient. Modernize everything, education, the penal system, prisons, voting. Get rid of the old, inefficient ways.
And second,
Government should interfere as little as possible. Laissez-faire. Especially in the economy, free trade, abolish import and export duties.
Isn't there a bit of a contradiction there? Efficiency might need more government intervention, while laissez-faire means less.
There absolutely is a tension there, one they wrestled with. But despite that, radicalism grew into this major protest movement, uniting working people, middle-class humanitarians, even some industrialists.
Which brings us to why there was so much discontent. It sounds like a perfect storm brewing after 1815.
It really was. You had the ongoing effects of both the industrial and agricultural revolutions causing immense hardship.
Like enclosures. Still happening then.
Yes. The process of consolidating land continued. Historians debate how bad it was. Chambers and Mingay play it down a bit. E.P. Thompson calls it class robbery.
But people definitely lost land, lost common rights.
Undeniably. Many became landless laborers, and with the population booming, lots of farm workers just weren't needed anymore.
And wasn't there that Speenham land system supposed to help the poor?
Introduced in 1795, yes. Magistrates topped up low wages from the poor rates based on bread prices and family size. A well-intentioned disaster, really.
How so?
It basically allowed farmers to pay even less, knowing the parish would make up the difference. The burden just shifted on to ratepayers, and the poor rates actually doubled between 1795 and 1812.
Plus, new machines were putting people out of work.
Everywhere. Farms, factories, mines. Technological unemployment was hitting hard. The classic example is the hand-loom weavers.
Their wages just collapsed, didn't they?
Plummeted. From maybe 21 shillings a week in 1802 down to 6 shillings or even less by 1832, all because of power looms. Cobbett wrote about it, how lamentable it was.
And if you moved to the towns seeking work, the conditions were grim.
Often horrific. It's hard to generalize, of course. But 16-hour days were common. Child labor, too. Kids as young as 5 working 14 hours.
And that truck system, paying workers in goods or vouchers?
Yes, forcing them to buy from company shops, often at inflated prices. It bred huge resentment.
Yeah.
Plus, just the loss of freedom, the rigid discipline of factory life. And wages often didn't keep up with prices.
And the towns themselves were growing incredibly fast.
Too fast. Unplanned. Cities like Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow. Their populations exploded between 1801 and 1831.
Leading to?
Slums, basically. Jerry-built housing, terrible sanitation, dangerous overcrowding. Lowe mentions 20,000 people living in cellars in Manchester by 1820. And lots of poor Irish immigrants arrived, providing even more cheap labor, pushing wages down further.
So you have these underlying revolutionary changes, and then the end of the Napoleonic Wars just makes everything worse.
Massively aggravates it. Suddenly there's an agricultural depression. Corn prices collapsed after the war overproduction, foreign corn coming back in, good harvests.
Bad news for farmers.
Especially smaller ones. Bankruptcies, laborers laid off. Then you get an industrial slump too. Government stops buying war supplies, that's maybe 50 million orders gone. European countries put up tariffs, so British exports fell sharply by about 30% by 1818. Half the blast furnaces shut down, less demand for coal. It ripples through the whole economy.
And all the soldiers and sailors coming home?
Over 200,000 demobilized men flooding the job market. By late 1816, estimates suggest maybe 500,000 people were unemployed. It was a crisis on a scale they'd never seen before.
And the government's own actions didn't exactly help, did they?
Some things definitely made it worse. The combination laws were already on the books, making unions illegal, which caused deep resentment.
But then came the Corn Laws of 1815.
Infamous. Forbidding foreign wheat imports until the home price hit 80 shillings a quarter, designed purely to protect landowners' profits.
But it meant bread prices soared.
Dramatically. A 4-pound loaf went from 10 pence to over a shilling between 1816 and 17. People inevitably accused the Tory landowners of lining their own pockets while the poor starved.
And abolishing income tax in 1816, that sounds like a good thing?
Good for the wealthy who paid it. But the government lost £15 million a year in revenue, money they desperately needed to pay the interest on the huge national debt from the wars, that was $31 million a year.
So how did they make up the shortfall?
By increasing indirect taxes. On everyday things, tea, sugar, tobacco, beer, soap, candles, things the poor consumed.
So the poor, who never paid income tax anyway, ended up paying more.
Exactly. It disproportionately hit the poorest. You can see why the government became incredibly unpopular around this time, and their response to protest was often just repression, which only deepened the bitterness.
So how did people express all this anger and frustration?
In various ways. The radicals tried peaceful means, pamphlets, speeches, mass petitions, but there were also marches, demonstrations. Some turned violent.
And the government saw revolution behind every corner.
They seemed convinced of a widespread conspiracy, probably mistakenly. They feared another France.
But the radicals kept pushing Cobbett's two-penny trash.
Hugely influential. His political register, sold weekly from 1816 for just 2 pence, reached maybe 60,000 readers a week. He hammered away at taxation, demanded parliamentary reform, universal male suffrage, annual elections.
Other radical papers, too.
Yes, like Thomas Wooler's Black Dwarf. And while figures like Henry Ord or Hunt were often involved in agitation, most radicals, as we said, favored peaceful methods to keep credibility.
But violence did erupt. The Luddites, for instance.
That started earlier, 1811-12 mainly, but flared up again. Textile workers hit by hardship and new machinery, smashing frames, burning factories.
And the government came down hard.
Very hard. Frame breaking became a capital offense. 17 Luddites were hanged in York in 1813. Sporadic incidents continued until 1817. E.P. Thompson argued it was more than just economic desperation, maybe an early form of political action by the working class. Others debate that.
What about the Spa Fields meetings in 1816?
Led by Hunt, calling for reform. But some extremists, like Arthur Thistlewood, had more violent aims. A breakaway group rioted, looted a gunsmith shop. Chaos erupted even before Hunt spoke.
Then the March of the Blanketeers in 1817.
A rather sad affair. About 600 unemployed Manchester weavers tried to march to London with petitions for the Prince Regent, carrying blankets for the journey.
What happened?
Most were arrested or scattered by cavalry near Stockport. Nothing came of it, except prison for the leaders.
And the Derbyshire Rising. That involved a government spy.
Yes, a notorious figure called Oliver. He apparently encouraged about 300 poor stocking makers and quarrymen to march on Nottingham, telling them a national uprising was planned.
But it wasn't.
No. Cavalries were waiting. They were easily dispersed, and 3 leaders were later executed for treason. A very murky business involving agents provocateurs.
Which brings us to Peterloo in 1819, the most infamous incident.
Without doubt. St. Peter's Fields, Manchester. A huge crowd, maybe 60,000 men, women, children, completely unarmed, gathered peacefully for a radical meeting with Henry Hunt.
But the authorities panicked.
Terribly. They ordered the local yeomanry, basically volunteer cavalry, to arrest Hunt. They charged into the crowd with swords drawn.
The result was carnage.
11 people killed, hundreds injured. Lowe says 161 had saber wounds. Appalling. And the government's reaction, they congratulated the magistrates.
And passed the 6 Acts.
Yes, a raft of repressive legislation aimed at crushing dissent. The name Peterloo was coined immediately, a bitter, ironic comparison to the victory at Waterloo.
And finally, the Cato Street Conspiracy in 1820.
A desperate, almost farcical plot by that same Arthur Thistlewood and a small group. Their plan was to assassinate the entire cabinet while they were at dinner.
Seriously? And then what?
Parade their heads on pikes, seize key buildings, proclaim a republic, hoping the London mob would rise up. It was completely unrealistic. A half-baked plot, as Lowe calls it.
And it failed.
Miserably. Government spies knew all about it. They were arrested in a stable on Cato Street. Thistlewood and 4 others were executed, 5 more transported.
Did it achieve anything?
Not really, except maybe seeming to justify the government's earlier repression in some people's eyes. After that, though, agitation did die down considerably in 1820.
Why was that? The repression worked.
Partly, perhaps. But mostly is the economy improving. Exports picked up, unemployment fell, good harvests brought bread prices down. As Cobbett famously quipped, "I defy you to agitate a fellow with a full stomach."
So, looking at the government's response before, say, 1820, it was mainly repression.
Overwhelmingly, their priority was stopping violence, maintaining order. You have to remember who elected them, well, wealthy landowners.
Yeah.
And they were genuinely scared by the French Revolution. Liverpool himself had seen the Bastille fall. They felt they had everything to lose.
And they didn't really have the tools for subtle policing.
No professional police force yet. They relied on local magistrates, often inexperienced, who tended to panic, like at Peterloo.
And they genuinely believed revolution was imminent.
It seems so. Despite little real evidence of a coordinated plot and most radicals favoring nonviolence, they seemed unable to see how their own policies, like the Corn Laws, were fueling the fire.
So Lord Sidmouth, the Home Secretary, oversaw this repression.
Yes. Heavy use of spies and informers, as we saw with Oliver. These agents didn't just report. Sometimes they actively encouraged illegal activities to entrap people. Thompson's quote, "The government wanted blood," might be strong, but it reflects that harsh mindset.
What else did they do? The game laws.
The 1816 game law made poaching punishable by transportation for 7 years, though juries were often reluctant to convict for that.
And suspending habeas corpus?
In 1817, after Spa Fields, that meant they could hold suspects indefinitely without trial. They banned seditious meetings. These were the gagging acts. Many radical leaders were arrested. Cobbett fled to America for a while.
And the 6 Acts in 1819 were the peak of this.
Absolutely. The government's most drastic response right after Peterloo. Powers for warrantless searches for arms and seditious literature. Bans on private military drilling. Restrictions on public meetings limiting them to parish residents to stop large crowds gathering.
And measures against the press.
Yes, speeding up trials for political offenses to bypass potentially sympathetic juries, and crucially, increasing the stamp duty on pamphlets to try and price radical publications out of reach for ordinary people.
Did they try any reforms alongside the repression?
Very little, and mostly ineffective. There was the Factory Act of 1819, pushed by Robert Peel's father. It forbade employing children under 9 in cotton mills and limited older children's hours.
But it didn't work well.
Limited scope, only cotton mills, and no real enforcement mechanism. Same with the Truck Act of 1820, trying to curb payment in goods. Largely failed.
So the unrest died down mainly because people had fuller stomachs, not because of government actions?
That seems to be the main factor, yes. Economic recovery played the biggest role in calming things down after 1820.
Which then sets the stage for the liberal Tory era from 1822 onwards.
Exactly. It's a fascinating shift. In 1822-23, Liverpool makes some key changes to his cabinet. He brings in these more progressive figures we mentioned earlier.
George Canning at the Foreign Office, Robert Peel, the younger one, as Home Secretary.
F.J. Robinson at the Exchequer. William Huskisson at the Board of Trade. A significant injection of new blood.
And these men were different, more middle-class backgrounds.
Some were, yes. Peel's father was a hugely successful cotton manufacturer. Canning's mother was an actress. They weren't all from the traditional landed aristocracy, perhaps making them more open to new ideas, particularly around commerce and industry.
Why did Liverpool bring them in then? Was it just Castlereagh's death opening a spot?
That was the immediate trigger for Canning's return. But it seems Liverpool had a broader strategy. He likely hoped that introducing moderate social and economic reforms could win over middle-class opinion, maybe gain support for manufacturers.
And take the wind out of the sails of the parliamentary reform movement, which he still opposed.
Precisely. Deflect the pressure for fundamental political change. The timing was also right. Law and order had been restored, so reforms wouldn't look like caving into violence.
And maybe weaken the Whigs, too.
That was probably part of the calculation, yes. Plus, the whole embarrassing Queen's affair in 1821, George V trying to divorce Queen Caroline, had shown how out of step the government was with public feeling. Bringing in popular figures like Peel and Canning helped refresh their image.
But we should be careful calling it a complete break from the past.
Definitely. Lowe emphasizes this. It wasn't a sudden conversion to liberalism. Some reforms were already underway, albeit slowly. And crucially, most Tories, including these liberal ones, still opposed major democratic parliamentary reform at this point. Liberal here means more open-minded to practical improvements, not necessarily democratic principles yet.
Okay, so let's look at the reforms themselves. Huskisson's economic changes sound quite radical for the time.
They were. Huskisson was a follower of Adam Smith, believed in free trade, competition, private enterprise. He started dismantling the old protectionist system.
Cutting import duties.
Massively. On raw materials like silk, wool, cotton, iron, copper, and also on manufactured goods. He wanted cheaper raw materials for British industry and more competition to make it efficient.
And changes to colonial trade? Navigation laws?
Yes, he relaxed restrictions, allowing colonies to trade directly with foreign countries. He modified the centuries-old navigation laws with the Reciprocity of Duties Act, basically agreeing mutual free trade for shipping with countries willing to do the same.
And the corn laws? Did he scrap them?
Not entirely, but he introduced a sliding scale in 1828. The import duty on foreign corn would go down as the domestic price went up, making it slightly more flexible.
What was the impact?
Long-term, very positive. Cheaper materials, more competitive industries, booming exports, less smuggling. Short-term, there were bumps, lost government revenue, a brief slump in 1825, which some people unfairly blamed on Huskisson.
And his tragic end, hit by a train.
Yes, killed by Stephenson's rocket locomotive at the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1830. A rather grim end to a significant reforming career.
Another huge change was repealing the combination laws in 1824. Finally legalizing trade unions.
A massive step. Campaigners like Francis Place and Joseph Hume argued the existing laws were counterproductive. Unions existed anyway, often disguised as friendly societies. They argued legal unions would be more responsible.
And Huskisson bought it?
Hume got a parliamentary committee, and they managed to persuade Huskisson. The repeal in 1824 was described as extremely liberal.
But it led to a wave of strikes.
It did. Suddenly legal, unions pushed hard for wage increases in 1825. Employers were furious, demanded the laws be reinstated.
But they weren't fully reinstated.
No, Place and Hume fought a rearguard action. The Amending Act of 1825 allowed unions to exist and bargain over wages and hours, but it heavily restricted strike action, prohibiting molesting or obstructing. So a step forward, but with significant limitations remaining. Still, a foundation was laid.
Now, Peel at the Home Office, he tackled law and order, but from a different angle than Sidmouth.
Completely different. Peel was influenced by reformers like Bentham, Romilly, Elizabeth Fry. He saw the existing criminal code as barbaric and inefficient.
Too many death penalties.
Over 200 capital offenses. For things like stealing bread, damaging trees, impersonating a Chelsea pensioner. Juries often wouldn't convict because the punishment was absurdly harsh, so criminals walked free.
So Peel reformed the penal code.
Radically between 1823 and 1830. He abolished the death penalty for about 180 crimes, made punishments generally less severe, ended practices like burying suicides at crossroads with a stake through the heart, reorganized the jury system, stopped using spies, a huge humanization of the law.
Though some harsh punishments remained.
Oh yes, transportation to Australia continued, imprisonment for debt, public hangings. It wasn't perfect, but a massive improvement.
And prison reform, the Jails Act of 1823.
Yes, aimed at removing the worst abuses. Required magistrates' inspections, paid jailers properly so they didn't extort prisoners, female prisoners supervised by female warders, some basic education and health care. But it mainly applied to larger city prisons. Smaller, local jails often remained grim.
And Peel's most famous legacy, the Metropolitan Police.
The Bobbies, or Peelers, established in 1829, London's first professional, centrally controlled police force, replaced the inefficient old system of watchmen and constables.
They were deliberately unarmed.
Except for a wooden truncheon, yes. Peel wanted them seen as civilian peacekeepers, not a military force occupying London. There was opposition initially, fears about cost, state power, French-style spies.
But they proved effective.
Hugely. Crime rates in London dropped significantly. Their disciplined, preventative approach won public respect over time and became the model for forces across the country. A truly landmark reform.
And finally, the religious reforms. Repeal of the Test and Corporation Acts.
In 1828, these were ancient laws restricting public office to members of the Anglican Church. In practice, nonconformists often held office anyway, but the repeal removed the legal barrier and the stigma. A big step for religious equality.
But it didn't apply to Catholics yet.
Not yet. That came the following year, 1829, with the Catholic Emancipation Act. And that one tore the Tory party apart.
Okay, so despite all these reforms, the Tory party basically implodes by 1830. What went wrong?
Several things converged. The first big blow was Liverpool having a stroke and resigning in early 1827. He really was the glue holding the factions together.
And Canning took over.
Yes, but the high Tories, including Peel and Wellington, refused to serve under him. They deeply distrusted his liberal foreign policy and, crucially, his known sympathy for Catholic emancipation.
So Canning had to bring Whigs into his government.
He did, a sign of how fractured the Tories were. But then Canning himself died suddenly just a few months later. After a brief, failed attempt by Lord Goderic to form a government, the king turned to the Duke of Wellington.
The war hero, but he couldn't hold it together either.
No. He managed to bring Peel back, but soon fell out with Huskisson and the other Canningites over parliamentary reform issues. They resigned. So Wellington lost the party's liberal wing.
And then came the breaking point, Catholic emancipation, driven by the crisis in Ireland.
Entirely. Remember, Ireland was overwhelmingly Catholic, but ruled by a Protestant minority who controlled land and government. Catholics couldn't sit in Parliament, despite promises made back at the Act of Union in 1800.
George III and George IV blocked it.
Yes, claiming it violated their coronation oath to uphold the Protestant faith. It was a major source of grievance.
Enter Daniel O'Connell.
A brilliant strategist,
Yeah.
Catholic barrister who built this incredible nonviolent mass movement through the Catholic Association, founded in 1823.
Funded by the Catholic rent.
Yes, even the poorest peasants contributed a penny a month. It gave the association huge influence. They started backing Protestant candidates who pledged to support emancipation.
And the County Clare election in 1828 was the flashpoint.
Absolutely. O'Connell himself stood for election against a pro-emancipation Protestant MP, Vesey Fitzgerald. O'Connell won a landslide victory, thanks to the votes of the 40-shilling freeholders, small Catholic tenant farmers who had the vote.
But as a Catholic, he couldn't take his seat?
Exactly. It created an impossible situation. If Catholics started winning seats across Ireland but were barred from Parliament, the prospect of civil war seemed terrifyingly real.
So Wellington and Peel, despite opposing emancipation for years,
Felt they had no choice. Peel had been nicknamed Orange Peel for his staunch anti-Catholic stance. But both became convinced emancipation was the lesser evil, the only way to avoid catastrophe in Ireland. Wellington famously said he'd rather sacrifice his life than see even 1 month of civil war.
So they pushed the Catholic Emancipation Act through in 1829.
They did, using all their political muscle. Wellington basically strong-armed the House of Lords, and Peel skillfully managed the Commons. King George V hated it, but eventually gave in when they threatened to resign.
What was the immediate fallout?
Well, ironically, O'Connell had to stand for election in County Clare again because the act wasn't retrospective, and the government simultaneously raised the property qualification to vote in Irish counties to £10, disenfranchising most of those 40-shilling freeholders who had elected O'Connell. A very cynical move.
But O'Connell won again anyway. What about the Tory party?
It was shattered. The hardline Protestant Tories, the Ultras, felt utterly betrayed by Wellington and Peel. They never forgave them. Peel had to resign his Oxford University seat because of the backlash. Wellington even fought a duel with an earl who accused him of treachery.
So the party lost its liberal wing and now it's right wing too.
Pretty much. Peel and Wellington were isolated. As Douglas Hurd points out, though, emancipation was a landmark reform, forced by peaceful popular pressure. But it fatally wounded the Tory party.
And then things got worse again in 1830. More unrest.
Yes, a combination of factors. Poor harvest in 1829 meant high bread prices again. An industrial slump caused unemployment in the north. Revolutions in France and Belgium added to the febrile atmosphere. You saw the swing riots in southern England, laborers burning hayricks, smashing new threshing machines.
And Wellington's government looked weak.
Too weak, too divided to respond effectively. This renewed the calls for the one thing they hadn't touched: parliamentary reform.
The pressure built again?
Massively. Many Whigs now saw moderate reform as essential to prevent revolution, but Wellington dug his heels in.
Famously declared the existing system perfect.
Virtually perfect, yes.
Yeah.
In November 1830, facing pressure in Parliament after a poor election result, he made a speech staunchly resisting any reform. That was the final straw. A few days later, he was defeated in the Commons on a different issue and resigned.
Opening the door.
A new government, under the Whig leader, Lord Grey, committed to introducing a reform bill. The long era of Tory dominance was over, largely due to their inability to hold the party together and adapt to the pressures for change, especially on religion and representation.
So looking back, how do historians judge this whole Tory period, 1815-1830? It's complex, isn't it?
Very. There's a big debate. Was there a sudden lurch towards liberalism in 1822, as older historians thought? Or was it more gradual, as recent scholars like Cookson and Gash argue?
They see more continuity, reforms speeding up after 1822, but building on earlier foundations.
Yes. They argue the government was generally cautious, pragmatic, aiming for reforms that had broad support. And figures like Canning, Peel, Huskisson were already influential before 1822. It wasn't a complete personality transplant.
And historians often distinguish between their political and economic policies.
That's a key point. They can be quite progressive, even radical, on economic matters like trade by the 1820s, but remain deeply conservative on political reform, on changing the Constitution, right up until the end.
What about their motives? Were they just selfishly protecting the landowners?
That's the traditional critique, citing the Corn Laws, abolishing income tax, but others offer different takes. Boyd Hilton suggests maybe more disinterested motives, trying to ensure national prosperity first through agriculture, then industry. Philip Harling suggests the liberal Tories aim specifically to reduce the tax burden on the middle classes and run government efficiently to win their support and, crucially, head off demands for more radical constitutional change. Keep the middle class happy so they don't demand the vote.
But that strategy failed when the economy tanked again in 1829-30.
Exactly. Economic distress brought political reform right back to the top of the agenda.
And Liverpool himself, arch mediocrity, arch reactionary.
He's been called both. Disraeli wasn't kind, but he oversaw significant reforms, especially after 1822. And his ability to manage that difficult cabinet for 15 years was remarkable. N.H. Brasher's defense is quite good. If Liverpool was an arch mediocrity, it is a pity that Britain has had so few of the breed since. And Jonathan Perry makes the point that these liberal Tories, even though the party collapsed, arguably laid the foundations for what would become the Liberal Party later in the century.
So we've taken a deep dive into a period that often gets painted with broad strokes, from post-war despair and popular unrest to the surprising emergence of liberal reforms under a Tory government. It's a testament to the complexities of history, isn't it? What stands out to you as the most surprising revelation from this deep dive?
Indeed. What's truly fascinating here, I think, is how this government, initially so resistant, so repressive, ultimately found itself pushed into quite significant reforms by overwhelming social and economic pressures. Even if, as we've seen, their core motives are still really debated by historians, it constantly raises that question. How much of this shift was about genuine progress, a real change of heart? And how much was it, well, fundamentally about preserving power, managing discontent, and preventing what they feared most, a full-blown revolution?
That's a great point. And as you think about this turbulent era, consider this provocative thought. How do the dynamics we've explored today, this interplay between public outcry, government response, the sometimes slow, sometimes sudden evolution of political ideas, how do these patterns continue to echo in our own world, even when the specific issues and players have changed? What's the biggest takeaway for you from this period of British history?